There's a moment, usually quiet, often painful, when you realize something radical. Nobody cares. Not in the way you imagined. Not in the way you hoped. Not in the way you secretly depended on. People aren't watching your every move. They're not waiting for you to succeed or fail. They're too busy thinking about themselves. And while that might sound depressing at first, here's the truth that Jean-Paul Sartre uncovered. When you finally accept that nobody cares, you become unstoppable. Think about it. How much of your life have you lived trying to impress, please, or avoid disappointing people who have already forgotten your name? How often have you edited yourself, dimmed your light, or altered your desires to fit into a narrative that wasn't even yours? Sartre's existentialism drops a bomb on that entire illusion. There is no script. There is no divine audience applauding or booing your every move. There is only you, your choices, your moments, your responsibility. And when that finally hits you, when you stop performing for a crowd that doesn't exist, you stop being afraid. You stop hesitating. You start living with terrifying freedom.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's pause here. Ask yourself this: what would you attempt if you truly believed nobody was watching? What would you build, say, risk, or destroy if you didn't need to be understood before you acted? That's the Sartrean shift. You go from fearing judgment to realizing there is no judge. There's only you and your choices. And that's not just liberating, it's powerful. Because suddenly your fear of failure becomes irrelevant. Your fear of looking stupid, useless, your hesitation to take the leap, gone. Why? Because you know the secret: no one cares as much as you think they do. And that's exactly why you should do it anyway. Sartre called this condition abandonment, not in the emotional sense, but in the metaphysical one. He meant that we've been abandoned by the idea of a pre-written meaning. There's no grand design, no universal purpose, no default path. And again, that sounds terrifying until you realize what it means. You're free. Radically, unapologetically, unpredictably free. You're not here to fulfill anyone else's expectations. You're not here to meet society's checklist. You're here to choose. And with that choice comes the birth of authentic power, the kind of power that no one can take from you because no one gave it to you in the first place. But let's go even deeper. Why does it hurt so much to realize nobody cares? Because we've been raised to believe our worth is relational. We think we matter if we're loved, if we're praised, if we're seen. But Sartre flips that upside down. He says your essence doesn't precede your existence, it follows it. In other words, you don't come into this world with a fixed meaning, you create it. Through action, through decision, through commitment. And that commitment doesn't require permission. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need to be understood. It just needs to be yours. So here's the turning point. You either keep waiting for the world to care, or you start creating as if it doesn't. The first path is hell. The second is freedom. The first will keep you paralyzed, always asking, what will they think? The second unleashes you, because now you ask, what do I think? What do I want to build, become, express regardless of who notices? And that's when art happens. That's when purpose emerges. That's when movements begin. Not when people care, but when you don't need them to anymore. Let me give you a real-world example. Why do you think most people never start that YouTube channel, write that book, launch that idea, or say what they actually believe? It's not because they lack talent. It's not because they're lazy. It's because they're trapped in a psychological prison, the illusion of the audience. And that illusion is so strong, so embedded, that they self-censor before anything real even begins. But when you apply Sartre's truth, when you accept that the audience is mostly a ghost, you begin to act anyway. You make the video, you write the post, you take the risk. And that act, that defiance, is the birth of authentic selfhood. Sartre would say you're now engaging in authentic existence. That means you're no longer outsourcing your decisions to fear, to norms, to the invisible eyes you think are watching. You're choosing based on conscious freedom. And yes, it's terrifying, because you can no longer blame anyone else. You can't say, well, they pressured me, or they expected it. No, now it's you, your life, your path, your consequences. And that's why most people reject this level of freedom. They're afraid to own it. But if you don't reject it, if you stare it down and embrace it, you become something rare, a person who acts without needing validation. Now ask yourself, what would you do today if you knew no one would clap? Would you still do it? Would you still care? Could you still love it? That's the test. That's the fire that burns away everything false. If you can keep creating, building, becoming even when no one's watching, that's when you know you're free. That's when you know you've transcended the social contract and stepped into sovereignty. And the irony, that's often when people start to care. When they sense you don't need them, they become curious. When they see that you act from something deeper, they begin to follow. But by then, it no longer matters, because you're not doing it for them. You're doing it because it's true. This is the Sartrean paradox. The less you need people to care, the more powerfully you show up. Because now, you're not performing. You're being. And being real, raw, present being is magnetic. It's rare. It's electric. Not because it's trying to be, but because it doesn't need to be. That's the deep freedom Sartre was pointing to. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to be who you are without apology, even when nobody claps, and especially when nobody watches. But this freedom isn't given, it's earned through fire, through rejection, through loneliness, through the death of your need to be seen. And once that need dies, a new you is born, one who doesn't ask for permission, one who doesn't wait for approval, one who doesn't flinch at silence. Because you've seen the truth, nobody cares, and that's your advantage. It means you're free to fail, to try, to speak, to risk, to become. Because the stage is empty. The spotlight is off. And that's when the real performance begins, not for them, but for you. When you kill the spotlight, when you stop living your life under the imagined glare of an audience that isn't really watching you unlock something most people never touch in their entire existence, creative sovereignty. You no longer act for applause. You act because the act itself is an extension of your being. Sartre would call this existence preceding essence, the idea that who you are is not something you discover, but something you create through your choices, but not through reflection alone, but through action. And once you realize no one is waiting to validate you, you begin to act more purely, more boldly. You stop editing yourself for mass appeal. You start expressing yourself for meaning, for truth, for depth. And that's when the world begins to shift, not because it suddenly cares, but because you've stopped needing it to. But make no mistake, this moment doesn't come easy. The death of the audience is painful. It requires you to grieve the version of you that needed to be seen, liked, affirmed. It forces you to confront the terrifying silence that follows when you say something real, and no one responds. It dares you to keep going anyway. Sartre saw this as the burden of freedom. We are condemned to be free, he wrote, meaning we don't get to choose whether we are free, only what we do with it. And that means your life is yours to shape. Fully, brutally, beautifully. This is the moment where most people quit, by the way. They realize no one's clapping, so they stop dancing. But the ones who keep dancing, they're the ones who change everything. So let me ask you something uncomfortable. Why are you still waiting for permission? Why are you still holding back your truth, your art, your ideas, just because the crowd isn't cheering yet? Do you think the cheering is what makes it real? Or is it you, the one who chooses to create, to speak, to live fully, even in the dead silence of indifference? That's what separates the authentic from the artificial. The authentic creator, the authentic human, doesn't need the crowd. They outgrow the crowd. They begin to see that the audience was never the point. The point was to become so aligned with your inner compass that even if the world never acknowledged you, you'd still feel your life was worth living. That's power. That's existential fire. That's freedom. Here's the irony. The moment you stop needing the world to care, the world begins to notice. But by then, you're not doing it for them, you're doing it for the message, for the mission, for the moment itself. Take any powerful creator, thinker, revolutionary. They didn't begin with a crowd. They began in obscurity. But they were willing to stay in that obscurity long enough for their message to crystallize, evolve, and find its own gravitational pull. Sartre would say they became the authors of their own meaning, not because they were chosen, but because they chose themselves. And that's what you must do. Kill the spotlight. Burn the script. Walk off the stage and build your own. And what happens once you do all this? Something transcendent. You stop being a consumer of reality and become a creator of it. No longer reacting to life's events like a character in someone else's play. Now you're the playwright, the director, and the actor. You begin to make decisions not based on how they'll be perceived, but on how deeply they align with your personal truth. And that's the kind of energy that can't be ignored. It's raw, it's rare, it's real. And Sartre would say that's exactly what it means to live in good faith, to act not from illusion or habit, but from conscious, sovereign choice. When you accept nobody cares, you release yourself from the prison of performance. And in that release, you don't fade, you ignite. There is a moment quiet, invisible to the outside world, when something irreversible happens deep within you. You stop asking, "What does this mean?" and begin declaring, "This is what it means to me." That shift is everything. It's the spark that turns a passive observer into a conscious creator. But Jean-Paul Sartre understood this better than almost anyone. He saw that the modern human being is no longer tethered to divine instructions, cultural absolutes, or even historical momentum. We are free, terrifyingly so. And with that freedom comes a fire, the fire of self-authorship. The lazy, the fearful, the distracted will run from it. But the bold will stand in it, let it burn away everything false and emerge untouchable. Not because the world has changed, but because they have. When you become the source of your own meaning, you stop being reactive. You stop letting other people's opinions, silence, or absence dictate your value. Someone ignores you. It doesn't rattle you. You weren't speaking for them. Someone mocks your project, your art, your risk. Doesn't matter. You didn't do it for their applause. You did it because not doing it would have been betrayal of your own becoming. And once you operate from that position, once your compass points inward rather than outward, you become radically independent. Not in the shallow, self-centered way society often praises, but in the existential way, grounded, awake, and unwilling to live anyone else's story but your own. Sartre called this bad faith when we pretend we're not free, when we hide behind roles, expectations, or labels to avoid the anxiety of choice. And that's what most people do, whether they realize it or not. They say, I have to keep this job. No, you choose to. I can't say that. No, you're afraid to. I should be grateful. No, you're conditioned to feel guilty for asking for more. But the one who has accepted that no one cares, that person stops living in bad faith. They stop pretending the script is still in place. They step fully into the absurdity and beauty of freedom. They begin writing their own lines. And if those lines happen to echo through the world one day, fine. If not, also fine. Because they weren't written for fame. They were written for truth. Here's the craziest part. Once you become the source of your own meaning, you don't just become untouchable, you become useful. Deeply useful. To others. To the world. To culture. Why? Because now every word, every action, every creation that flows from you carries weight. It's not diluted by performance. It's not infected by people-pleasing. It's forged in solitude, in reflection, poured in fire. And that kind of energy is rare. That kind of energy heals, provokes, awakens. You become a mirror for others' potential. Not because you're trying to be, but because you're living it. And that's what we're all secretly looking for, not more influencers, but more individuals. Not more content, but more conviction. Not more noise, but more reality. So here's the final question. And I want you to really sit with this. If no one ever cared, if no one ever noticed, if no one ever remembered your name, would you still live this way? Would you still write that book? Build that company? Say what you believe? Would you still become who you are becoming? Because if your answer is yes, if you can say, I would still do it, because it's mine, then you've already won. You've already crossed the invisible threshold that separates the asleep from the awake, the performer from the philosopher, the follower from the creator. And once you cross that line, there's no going back. You've tasted something too real, too powerful, to you to ever return to the illusion. And that's the final truth Sartre leaves us with. The world may never care. But that was never the point. The point was you. The point was your freedom, your fire, your refusal to be shaped by anything less than the truth. So now the spotlight is gone. The audience is silent. The stage is empty. What do you do next? That is where your real life begins.